everyone. Welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk Series brought to you by AKFI, Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. My name is Isabella. I am the co-host of this talk series here with Manuel, another co-host, also the executive director at the AKFI. And today we have Scott joining us as our special guest. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you, and thanks to this talk series, we get to connect with great minds from all over the world to discuss the current and the future state of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. Scott is a lawyer and technologist with over 25 years of leadership on ESG risk. He is the founder and CEO of Speeki, a full-service ESG and sustainability reporting and management partner to large corporates. And before that, Scott began his career in law, going on to build a track record of expertise across ESG risk management and corporate governance, spanning anti-corruption, sanction ethics, integrity, workplace issues, human rights, and governance. Once again, Scott, welcome, and great to have you, and look forward to hearing what you have to share today. And to open our conversation, what are the three most impactful trends you see today in corporate sustainabilities, and how these influencing businesses, strategies across different sectors, supply chains in general?
Right. Well, thanks for the question and for the introduction. If there were three things that I would focus on, I think they all relate to a similar message, which is companies around the world are starting their path on understanding ESG and sustainability significantly more than what they were in the last 5 to 10 years. So the trend, I guess the number one trend, is that companies are now starting to take these issues more seriously. The second trend, I think, is as they take it more seriously, they're realizing that ESG and sustainability issues are complex and they're interrelated. And they're things that are not simple to resolve and are going to take time. And so what I think companies are coming to realize, and the trending certainly is, that they're starting on a 5 to 10 to 15-year path on reorganizing themselves in order to address some of these ESG and sustainability challenges. I guess the third thing that I would say is that as part of that learning path, companies go through a series of changes. The first is they recognize that they need to consider ESG and sustainability issues. Then they go through this path, and the path is generally associated with some degree of confusion, some degree of shock that the issues are complex. And then they go through this path of trying to implement programs and implement ESG initiatives, but doing so in a way that's disconnected from the business. And so companies then finally realize that ESG and sustainability topics need to be part of the corporate strategy of the company. And so they generally reorient themselves and their programs to be more aligned to strategy. And that means they need to go through this challenging piece of looking at their company strategy and deciding how sustainability fits within that company strategy, and also vice versa. The sustainability teams need to realize that having sustainability without an impact on the corporate goals and objectives is also not sustainable. So companies literally go through that path, and we see them do that. And finally, they come to a stage where sustainability starts to be integrated into the business, and they start to get traction.
I think in some way the history repeats itself. We started finance with bookkeeping, right? Looking at the past and trying to keep track of, what comes in and what goes out. And eventually, and there's no secret, but there are only two people that talk to the Wall Street or to the investors, and this is the CEO and the finance. And this is because the CFO is part of the strategy. I will make an observation that in most cases, the CFO talks much more than the CEO. in those meetings.
I think that's correct. And what's surprising, I guess, to me as I work with companies is at that CEO and CFO and the CX level, there is quite a lot of lack of experience and knowledge around ESG and sustainability. And there is often a misunderstanding of its intention and misunderstanding of how to integrate it into the fabric of the business. I think they often see it as an initiative that someone's driving in the company, and it's something that they'll support with some funds, or they'll support some initiatives, but they haven't quite grasped yet that it's a little bit more than that, and it needs to blend into the organization and be a part of it. And that may require re-looking at the way they go to market, re-looking at the product suite that they have, thinking about how to re-engineer products or re-engineer manufacturing, or change perhaps the way in which they approach energy usage and emissions. And there's a whole gamut of issues. And often that C-suite just simply isn't prepared from a knowledge perspective in order to make some of those decisions, which are very impactful.
Absolutely. Actually, oversimplifying, but we are saying that the first obstacle is to move sustainability from a cost center, right? From that side of the balance sheet to the profit center. So you have to look at it as a way of making money, not necessarily just a way of spending money. Exactly the same way we do strategy, right? If you please go ahead.
And it's fairly clear now that, if you look at organizations and you look at their product strategy and they look at the way in which they engage with society and communities, it's pretty clear that the expectations now that companies do more than simply produce profits and returns to shareholders. I think there's an expectation now on pretty much everyone that companies play a pretty significant role in society, and that they need to address some of the societal challenges and the planetary challenges that we have, and that they're a part of that solution. They sit beside government and they sit beside members of the public, and all three groups need to work together in order to solve some of these challenges. So companies have now had a hard reality to realize that people are holding them accountable now for things other than simply profit and returning to shareholders. And so they need to adjust their thinking in addressing some of those challenges and providing value back to the planet and also to customers and the community as a whole. And so that will shift the way organizations think going forward into a different way of presenting themselves to their audience, that is, members of the public.
I think this is maybe the time to note that you started your career actually dealing with ethics of companies. And I'll turn to Isabella. She's our leader in talking about the ethics in AKFI. So please, Isabella.
Thank you, Manuel. It's a very confusing space as well, and I'm not an expert in it at all. I see it as very confusing. Everyone has their own standards when it comes to ethics. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Scott, and how do you see companies applying or integrating ethical compliance into their operations, and what does it mean actually? Because it's a really very a puzzling concept as we delve into it more and more.
It is a challenging concept because it operates at multiple layers. And so we look at the layer of the corporation itself. And the corporation itself is made up of a series of individuals. And those individuals set the purpose of the organization, and they set the standards for which the organization is going to operate. And that is essentially the governing body of the organization. So for most companies, that's the board. The board sets out the strategy for the company. It sets out the governance model. It sets out the rules, the purpose of the company. It sets out how do we want this company to operate? What's the framework in which we're going to operate to? What are the standards? And most importantly, what is our risk tolerance? What is our appetite to take on risk? And when a board sets out those things very clearly, it can then instruct management on how to execute on that strategy. And part of that execution and part of that governance strategy involves how they're going to handle issues like ethics and integrity. Are they a conservative-based organization, or are they more aggressive? How will they deal with certain challenges in the organization when they're ethically challenged? And these are issues that are really led at that company level, but also at the individual level, at the board of directors and the C-suite. And when there's alignment between those two groups, and there's clear messaging from the board to management, then management's in a position to then lead the organization through those ethics and integrity challenges that they will encompass in their everyday business lives. But without that clear direction and clear governance model and that clear risk tolerance, it's very hard for companies to know where in that gray area they should operate. And so I often look at the boards and the governing body to say, well, you set the standard of the organization. You set the principles that you want to work by and live by. You set the guidance for the CEO and for the management team. And so do your job, set those things, give the guiding principles, and that will then help the management team push that throughout the organization and set the standards by which the company is going to work on.
Thank you.
Please, Isabel.
Thank you. I just said thanks, Scott, for the sharing.
One observation with sustainability, as Scott, you very well know, now we are not only looking at the company and the board of the company from an ethics and setting the culture of the company as well. And I think there is a connection between ethics and culture. But also they are responsible to monitor the ethics of their supply chain. Things which come into my mind is forced labor, child labor, proper pay, which are now part, at least, of the legislation in some jurisdictions like European Union and so on. So I think ethics becomes part of a bigger picture. I don't know if you want to elaborate.
I think that when I look at an organization, I look at the organization and the ecosystem that sits around that organization. And that ecosystem includes both partners, but it also includes investors. It includes those companies that are aligned to it, for example, NGOs and regulators, but it also includes their supply chain. And supply chain is an essential part of companies, and it forms part of that ecosystem. And when we're operating companies, we get to decide at that board level and that management level, who do we allow within that ecosystem of our company? Who do we allow to come within the boundaries of that group? And so what we do when we work with procurement and supply chain is that we say to that part of the company, you have a role to play in ensuring that those people that provide services or products to our company, those that we allow into our ecosystem, need to come in with a certain set of standards. We have a certain set of principles, we have a certain set of standards in our company, and if you want to be part of that ecosystem, then you also need to meet those standards. And if you don't meet those standards, then we have a choice. We either bring you in on the condition that you do meet those standards, or we leave you outside the ecosystem and we choose somebody else. So when we look at it from that perspective, what we're really doing is saying we're supportive of, obviously, suppliers coming into our ecosystem, and they're essential, but we set the terms by which they come in. And those terms are not just supply-based terms, so pricing and quality, but they're the terms that we need to see from you for your entry right, your entry into that ecosystem. And the challenge for many companies is to work out, well, what should those rules and principles be that we need to review before you come into our ecosystem? Do we know what those rules and principles are? Firstly, have we articulated those to ourselves, and have we articulated them to our supply chain? But secondly, how do we how do we see whether or not this particular company meets those principles? And how do we assess them? And how do we continue to monitor them? And how do we make sure that they adhere to those principles while they're in our ecosystem? So when we look at it from that perspective, what we find is that companies have not articulated that to a degree that's clear, and suppliers are not necessarily judged on that criteria. And as a result, we end up finding this disconnect between what a company expects and what the supply chain can offer. And that's when we typically see problems arising, when suppliers act on behalf of the company and cause the company pain, because essentially they're acting outside the principles that should have been set by the company as to be a member of its ecosystem.
So I see, a couple of directions, and thank you for sharing this. One is the legal framework. Right now, usually the supply contracts are sort of weighted toward, okay, you have to deliver products or services in this framework. Not exactly you have to give us the data about let's say, where your materials or raw materials are coming from, what are your human relations and human rights performance. So I think there is a very gray area, as you mentioned before. Also, I think part of that it's also so that's a legal part, and as you said, it's also a lack of a mechanism to capture what exactly are the ethics of the company. It's sort of the same with culture I mentioned before. We know the culture when we see it, but we have troubles to define it. Okay, these are the main parameters. We are honest. We are forthcoming, and so.
That's right. And what you're describing is the fundamental challenge that companies have, because up until now, they've been relatively transactional in the sense that a company requests a service provider or a supplier provides that for a fee. So it's been a transactional issue. And so being a transactional issue, what you're looking at is payment in return for a product or service. And the determining factor will be whether or not that product or service is what you anticipate it to be, and it's priced accordingly. But what we're seeing now, however, is that the expectations are quite different. It's not transactional anymore. It's transactional and principles based. And so there's a principles element that sits around that transaction and says, well, there's a number of people who can provide that transaction. But in addition to providing that transactional approach, you also need to meet these principles. And the shift that companies need to make is moving from that transaction-based into that principles and transaction-based. And it's part of that transition that we talked about before, in the sense that you've got companies operating as this transactional, but they now need to realize that when you're looking at issues of sustainability and ethics and integrity and values, you're looking at those principles. And so the principles and the transactions don't always suit each other. And so blending them together and finding that way to do that is part of that challenge of building ESG and sustainability. But it's an essential part, because otherwise we will continue to be transactional and we'll continue to base our decisions based on numbers, money, and results. And we won't consider those purpose and those principles-based issues that are really what we need to have in order to drive a more sustainable future.
No, absolutely. So it's a much more complex change than just publishing your annual report, under double materiality and so on. And you mentioned a couple of times risks, and there are some substantial risks of not performing, within this concept, within this framework of double materiality. If I understand correctly, in Europe, the risk may be 4% of the gross revenue in the European Union markets. So the companies are they struggle, I think, and you are on the forefront with Speeki. So maybe tell us a little bit. Maybe you can share a story. No customer, name, but story about this kind of struggle to perform within at least the reporting framework, which, as you very well said, is not the major framework, is strategy, not reporting. Reporting is, yeah, we have to do it financially and so on.
Yes, we often look at the parallels with the financial world. So in the financial world, we decided 50, 60 years ago that in order for people to understand an organization, we needed to have some financials. And so we set about having some standards by which we should record financial statements. And these standards took a very long time to put together, but these standards are now ubiquitous with financial reporting. And we built systems in order to support our management of our financials and the reporting of our financials according to these standards. Now, within that, there are certain requirements of our financial standards that discuss materiality, in the sense that companies need to highlight to the world, investors, whoever reads those statements, that there are certain elements that might be classified as material. And the companies, not surprisingly, get to decide what is material for them. So material for one small company is going to be very different to a large company. So now let's fast forward into the non-financial world, and we look at the topics that are in the non-financial world. So we're currently looking at the non-financial elements, like, for example, emissions or waste, or areas around water usage or human rights, or areas around diversity, or perhaps even corruption. These areas are in the non-financial world. And so companies are now needing to understand, well, how do we manage the non-financial world alongside the financial? And we need to think through two things. What's the impact that our non-financial world has? So what is the impact that we have on society? And what is the impact that society is having on us? And then we need to do that across each of the non-financial topics. So across the corruption, all the way through to targets around, for example, waste or water or biodiversity or carbon emissions. And then we need to make the same decision that we made on the financial world, which is, well, what is material for our company? What is something that's important or material that we therefore need to disclose? And once we've gone through that process, then we're in a better position to build our non-financial model. Now we have a financial model sitting beside a non-financial model, and we know that those two things also interrelate themselves, because the impact of a non-financial issue may have a financial hit and vice versa. So as a result, we're now working out how to connect those non-financial and financial pieces together. So the transition that we're making now it's a very complex transition, because it involves areas which are qualitative in addition to quantitative. So in the financial world, it was mostly quantitative. In the non-financial world, it's both, because it's not necessarily what we're producing in the terms of emissions, but it's how we're doing that. And so there's a qualitative piece as well as quantitative. So as we're building this non-financial model, we're looking at those material elements, then we put it alongside the financial model and we start connecting the two together. And so over the next, I guess, 3, 5 to 10 years, hopefully we will see one day where there's financial reporting and non-financial reporting, and we'll see that those two things exist. There's materiality rules for both. They'll start to come together, and we'll see that interplay between both of them. And that's ultimately part of that bigger picture that we started this call on, which is when we see companies being measured both on financial and non-financial, we'll see those two things come together. But right now, we're in this very early stages where we're trying to work out what are the non-financial elements and how do we measure them? What are they? How do we collect data? How do we start to manage these issues? And we're at that very early stage of how to build those systems in companies. But the future is very clear. The message is very clear and the vision is very clear. We expect to see financial and non-financial together, linked in a report that sends a message to our stakeholders. And that message is financial and non-financial.
Thank you. And I'll make an observation here, or maybe two. Number one, the financial world definitely, the investment part of the financial world, the banks and the funds are already looking and trying to assess risk, because this is the, risk reward is the equation for every financial institution. And there is a high level of confusion, right? We have started with ESG funds, overhyped them. Then, I think now they are in a trap of disillusion. But that was one measurement of how the financial world is already looking at sustainability and ESG, and environment and social and governance and ethics, as we discussed before. The other one, which surprises me, shouldn't surprise me. The most sensitive to risk is the insurance industry. And the insurance industry already started, at least in the US, to say, okay, you are insurable, but it's a 3x, 5x premium next year because you are too close to the ocean, or too close to the forest, and the electricity can trigger a fire like in California. So that's the most sensitive and fast to respond to the ESG factors. And the other part is cybersecurity also, which is considered a risk. And as you said, that's already showing this interdependence between the financial risk and the non-financial risk, or non-financial reporting. So
That's correct. And what we've seen in the last, I think, 5 years is evidence of companies running into trouble, not because their financials were impacted, but because of a non-financial piece. Either it's related to a risk that appeared that might have been a country-based risk. So their operations in a particular country were impacted by, for example, political violence or by some local issue. We've seen companies run into significant trouble over issues associated with climate change. So we've seen companies who have had significant impacts to their business as a result of storms, or as a result of hurricanes, or climate events, which have really caused them significant challenges. So what's happened is these issues they're not new issues. They've always been there. And it's just that they're now becoming more pronounced, number one. Number two, the impact of them has now become far more significant. And so we've seen an escalation of these risk areas, which again have always been there. None of this is new, but the shifting of the priorities has changed. And so the planet has clearly shown us that these issues need to be moved up the list. And the planet has done that in a way that's been quite forceful. And so we are now forced to listen to that planet and realize that the planet is speaking. We need to listen, and that we need to shift some of our resources into managing these risks more effectively.
Yeah, actually, I'll make a connection with also what you described about ethical, right? So on one hand, we're part of the planet, right? Regardless of how much we want to consider ourselves, yes or no, part of the planet. So on one side, as you described, is the planet. The other part is the social, economic, and ethical part of stakeholders. So I think these two forces, as you said, they are coming to the forefront of companies, especially large companies that are global or multi-regional. And as you mentioned already, they have to become part of the strategies, not expected from the executives and the board of directors to be just reactive, right? Oh, we had a hurricane, we didn't expect it. Well, you had one last year, so no more excuses, we say in school.
That's right. But what that requires, though, is it requires the board and management to be very attuned to understanding risk. And they also need to be very aware of the changing environment. And that is the environment both in physical terms, meaning the natural environment, but also the environment and the expectations of people, of their customers and their suppliers and their partners, who are expecting more from companies. And so that changing environment, both literal and figuratively, means that they need to be aware of a lot more issues. And so they need to be groups that understand a little about a lot of things. In order to do their job effectively, they need to be experts in risk and they need to be experts across a lot of areas. And when I work with boards and management teams, surprisingly, there is a lack of experience and understanding in some of these areas. And when I start talking about issues of gross risk and net risk and talk about different levels of controls that may be there to manage risk and how we're measuring and monitoring those controls and we know they're effective, etc. There is a significant lack of expertise in understanding these concepts. And what I think has happened over the years is that organizations have got very comfortable understanding financial risk and they've got very comfortable understanding market risk, but they have really not turned themselves into thinking about ethics, integrity, people, environment, and social risks that are now just as pronounced and can now bring you into financial ruin potentially faster than the market risks. And so there's a shift that needs to happen in boards and executives in order to step up and really understand these risks. And it's challenging because they're broad. They're very broad topics and they cover a lot of ground. And as I often say, you need to know a little about a lot of topics in order to be a good board member or a good CEO.
Absolutely, but it takes half a generation to grow to groom and grow the new CEOs, the ones which come with an understanding or broader understanding, as you define it.
True, or they need to learn it. They need to go back to school and they need to learn it. I myself are constantly studying something at some stage, and I'm back right now at MIT doing a year-long course in sustainability because I felt I needed to learn more about the science. And I need to, in order to really advise companies, I need to understand the science and I need to understand engineering. I need to understand chemistry. I needed to understand how the relevant elements of ESG connected with each other so that I could understand and advise companies on how to build a more sustainable business. And so I had to go back and do some more study and, areas that you're focused on, areas like how to build design principles into sustainability and how to focus design and systems thinking into sustainability. These issues are absolutely key to make sustainability successful. And so I think organizations need to send some of their executives back to school and some executive programs, organizations like Cornell that are offering these solutions because they need to know these issues in order to properly be a member of their organizations and drive it in this new shift that's happening in the world.
Well, I'm an instructor at Cornell, so as you know probably, and I do have classes on sustainability and digital transformation, and I'm getting also a lot of help from Isabella and our small group of people helping AKFI. To understand the social issues, to understand the generational issues, which are far from being trivial. So I'm coming from a background of telecom and IT and data centers and so on. So technology, strong technological background. And suddenly I see that the world has changed hopefully or is changing hopefully to the better and not linearly to the better. But as Isabella mentioned, for instance, the issue of ethics and so on in business didn't come from being in the industry. It wasn't requested from me, and I was sometimes in strategy, sometimes in architecture, sometimes in marketing and PR. But those questions were not there. And of course, no answers.